Hi, how's it going? Here's Chapter 7, General Categories of Collective Behavior. Now, this is a fairly short chapter, and it also has some repetition in it from what we've already talked about. So we already know that collective behavior can take various forms. And as I've said, that, we as a society tend to focus on the ones that garner the most attention, and usually the ones that are most sensationalistic because they're most destructive. And we are going to talk about some of these. We're going to look at general categories of collective behavior. And a lot of these, I'm sure, I have no doubt you would have recognized what they were without having taken this class, but we're going to talk about them in more detail. We're going to talk about violent or destructive collective behavior, which includes mass suicides, mob violence, and riots. We'll talk about consumer and collective behavior. Consumers and collective behavior, which includes crazes and panics and fads. And we'll talk about hysterias. Hysterias include rumors, physical hysterias, millenarian groups, sightings, and miracles. So this sounds like a lot, but a lot of this is actually repetition. So we're going to start with consumer collective behavior. And some of this is going to be repeat. So as I said in the very first class, the majority of collective behavior is not destructive or violent. There's no harm. There's no injuries. It's simply people acting collectively. And a craze, which we have already talked about, is a consumer collective behavior. Remember, what's the difference between a craze and a fad? A craze has this emphasis on money. So a craze and a fad are essentially exactly the same, except a craze has this emphasis on money. Your textbook refers to some specific ones, and you might think some of these were made up, but actually, no, they're not. So a craze, focusing on money, purchasing something with the intent of eventually making money, such as the beer can collector's craze that took off during the 70s. Please note that I am being specific here, beer can, so it doesn't even have to have beer in it. It could be empty. In the 70s, this was very, very popular. In fact, it was in the year 1970 that the Beer Can Collectors of America formed, the BBCA, and this not only was formed for people who were already interested, but it also helped to increase awareness of this hobby, I guess you could call it, beer can enthusiasts, and it also led to the formation of other beer can collecting clubs. Eventually, this organization became the Brewery Collectibles Club of America. So it started in 1970, and by 1978, they had a few million members. However, by 2009, their membership had dropped to only 300 and, by 2009, I can't read my numbers. I need to go back to grade 6 math. Their numbers only totaled about 300,000, and the average age of members was 59. So by 2009, this quite clearly had a generational context to it. And at this point, almost all the members are seniors. So this certainly didn't last. And no, nobody's empty beer can collection ever made them any money. A more recent example of a craze is something like Pokemon cards. Now, Pokemon cards are something that you can participate in for different reasons. Some people participate in it as a fad, especially when it first came out, but other people want Pokemon cards specifically for the monetary value. The same with Pogs or Tamagotchis. Vintage toys have become very popular. That's why I've got a picture of this old man toy. It's from the Toy Story movie. When Star Wars first came out, I guess it's called Star Wars A New Hope. I just call it Star Wars. If you happen to still have original toys in their original boxes, you can make quite a bit of money. Cabbage Patch dolls are also an example of a fad or a craze, depending on the purpose for buying one. If you bought it for your kid to play with, well, then you were participating in it as a fad. If you bought it thinking, yep, this is going to go up in value and make me some money, then you're participating in it as a craze. Some are worth more, but very, very few. Barbies. If you have an original Barbie, it's worth almost $30,000. But the thing is, now a lot of these things are marketed as collectibles, and because of that, a lot of people have them, and because of that, they're not worth as much. We talked about Beanie Babies in another chapter and what a strong craze they were, and now we have hundreds of people with Rubbermaid containers full of Beanie Babies, not worth anything. Oh, sorry, there's Cabbage Patch Dolls again. I don't know why they're in between. And here we have some other ones. In the top left, these are Precious Moment figurines that were very popular in the 80s, especially. People were sure they'd be worth something. Believe it or not, something that's a really valuable collectible is the picture on the upper right. Those are original toys from McDonald's Happy Meals from when they first came out, because the toys were a lot different and nobody thought to keep them. So because they're more rare, they're worth more. On the bottom left, these are Norman Rockwell collectible plates. Again, something people thought, oh, they're going to be worth something, and they never were. And on the bottom right, you have Hummel figurines, something else that people bought with the intention that they'd be worth something someday, and they're not really worth anything. So these are all examples of consumer collective behavior. But something else that's an example of consumer collective behavior is not just a craze, it is a financial panic. When a large segment of the population try to sell something as fast as they can, because they feel the longer they keep it, the less valuable it will become. And as more people sell, more want to sell. And as they sell, more want to sell. So it's a very, very definite form of collective behavior. It's called a financial panic. It's consumer collective behavior. And the most common or the most well-known example of that is the stock market crash in 1929. This really was the most devastating financial panic to date in North America, when about $30 billion was lost. So I want to make sure you get this. It's not just, oh, people are selling things. It's people are absolutely panicking to sell something because they know if they keep it for another minute, they'll lose money, another minute, they'll lose money. So you have this huge group of people all wanting to sell at the same time. And that is exactly what the stock market crash was. In the 1920s, hundreds of thousands of people invested in the stock market in a way we had just never seen before. It was after World War I. There was this general feeling of optimism, of life being better and getting better, and they thought they'd never go to war again. So, and in addition, whereas before the stock market was viewed as a place for people who already had money, who had a certain degree of wealth to make more money, in the 20s, it became viewed as a place where everyday people could also make money. And newspapers would, in fact, report about everyday people getting rich from their investments, so maids and teachers, and this added to the excitement. But very few, what I'll call everyday people, actually had the money necessary to invest. So a whole lot of them did it, and they would buy on margin to do it. What does buy on margin mean? It means you put down 10 to 20% of what it would cost to buy a stock, and then your stockbroker would loan you the rest. Kind of like a mortgage. Very few people buy a house and pay for the entire house up front. So, most people put down 25, 30% or more, and then you have a mortgage. So this was the same kind of idea, but instead of buying a house, you were buying a stock. And then depending how many stocks you bought, that would obviously affect how much you spent. In fact, at the time of the stock market crash in October 1929, over $8.5 billion was out on loan because of people buying on margin. That was more than the entire amount of currency circulating in the United States at that time. And since so many people were buying so much stock, it made prices go up. It falsely inflated the prices of stock, sending the message that you could make money doing it, encouraging people more. So it really was this cyclical effect. It was a cycle. And like I said, when people borrowed money, it was called buying on margin. This is very, very similar as well to the huge real estate boom in the US that happened about 10 years ago and then went bust. And this seemed like such a sure thing that even companies were investing everything they had in the market. So it wasn't just individual people, it was also entire companies. And without the knowledge of their customers, many banks actually placed their customers' money into the stock market. And of course, believing that the investments would do fine. So overall, what this means is that the price of stocks were falsely inflated. So it wasn't that they were truly worth, let's just pick a number, like $10. Say it's $10 for one stock. So it wasn't that the stocks were actually worth $10. It's that because consumer demand drove up the prices would rise for a short period of time, and then eventually they were going to drop. They weren't actually worth that much. Once demand slowed, prices would drop and their value would drop. Now, when the stock market crash happened, it really happened over the course of a week. But the worst day that is remembered the most, the day when most of this came to a head, was Black Tuesday, October 29th, 1929. When the crash began, not just on one day, as there had been warning signs in the months leading up to it, largely ignored by everybody. Everybody was immediately scrambling to get their own money out as quickly as they possibly could. Investors wanted their money, knowing that otherwise they'd be left as owners of these stocks that were worth nothing. There were so many orders to sell on that day that the ticker fell behind. By the end of the close, it had lagged to 2.5 hours behind at the stock market. And people in every sense began to panic. They couldn't sell the stocks they had quick enough. They couldn't get their hands on their money quick enough. Everybody was trying to sell. Nobody was buying, and stock prices completely collapsed. So, simply put, everybody tried to sell, and that drove prices down, which meant people would be lucky to even break even, and many did not. Eventually, whoever had invested in the stock market couldn't even break even. So you have hundreds of thousands of people who have borrowed money to invest. Their investment is now worth nothing, but they still owe the money that they borrowed. This is called a margin call. Margin calls were sent out, which means that brokers demanded immediate repayment of loans in full, which they were totally legally allowed to do. And some banks who had been holding the money of their customers lost all their customers' money in the crash. So people were rushing banks to get their money out as quickly as possible, knowing that the bank would literally not have much money to return the accounts of everybody who had one.